Hello and welcome to this episode of Philosophy for Breakfast. And today we're just going to be looking at statesmen and statesmen alone. We're not going to look at the I Am discourses or the sonnets or anything, because there's quite a bit to get through here. So I just thought we'd focus on it for the time being. And I'm going to skip some sections. Some sections I'm going to read, and then some sections I'm going to sort of skim through fairly quickly. So by the end of this video, you're going to understand how Plato arrives at what a statesman is, or at least you're going to see the first part of the process to defining what a statesman is and what type of expertise that were mentioned in the previous videos we're actually talking about. So we're going to start off with some words from Socrates himself, who says, "There's a sense in which they both might be said to be related to me. At any rate, you all say that one of them looks like me, and the other is my namesake. Our names bring us into some kind of relationship. Now, relatives like us should always be happy to use conversation to get to know one another. The discussion I myself had with Theaetetus yesterday brought us together, and I've also listened to him answering you just now. On the other hand, I haven't seen Socrates in either role. I ought to see what he's made of as well, though, so I think you should put your questions to him now, and I can do so later." So that's Socrates talking about another Socrates, a younger Socrates. Not the Socrates, but just another guy called Socrates. Just another Socrates. And this other chap who we speak only of as the Visitor. So Visitor says, "Tell me, do you think we should or should not count him as another one of those people who are in possession of a branch of knowledge?" We're talking about what are we talking about? We're talking about the statesman. Young Socrates, "I think we should." Visitor, "So we better make distinctions between the various branches of knowledge as we did before when we were looking into the sophist." Young Socrates, "I imagine so." Visitor, "But I don't think it'll take the same division as before, Socrates." Young Socrates, "No?" Visitor, "No, it'll take a different one." "I suppose so. Where will we find the path that leads to the statesman then? I mean, that's what we have to do. We have to track statesmanship down, differentiate it from all other branches of knowledge by assigning it to a single identificatory category, and count all the rest as belonging to some other single category. Then we can get our minds to think of all branches of knowledge as falling into two categories." I'm not going to keep saying young Visitor and young Socrates, and Visitor and young Visitor, etc. I'm just going to hopefully it'll be clear when I'm switching character voices. The one who's talking the most is the Visitor, and young Socrates is the one sort of going, "Yes, no, I'm not sure. You think so? If you say so," and stuff like that. So they were just talking previously about the sophist, and they just had a whole dialogue about that, where they applied this method that they're going to apply now. So just note the method they're using. It's very when I was first reading it, I was like, what are they doing? This seems really weird and kind of dumb, actually. I was like, why would you start there? That doesn't make any sense. But let's keep going. Visitor, "Would you say that mathematics and similar disciplines have nothing to do with action, that all they provide us with is knowledge?" Yes. "Whereas the kind of knowledge which is involved in building and manual work is in general, is more or less essentially involved with action and assists these disciplines in their realization of physical entities which formerly did not exist." Of course. "So this gives you a criterion for differentiating between branches of knowledge in general. You can distinguish knowledge which is practical from knowledge which is purely theoretical. And I'm going to skip down to the little notes down below here, which says, the present search for forms or categories continues to assume that there are objective natural forms or kinds which we discover and whose existence does not depend on our conventions, and that we discover these through the philosophical use of reasoning. So this is used in the Socratic dialogues of definition. And Aristotle regards the process of division into two parts at each stage as a crude kind of definition by genus and differentia, and criticizes a version of it in chapters 2 and 3 of the first book of the Parts of Animals. But ultimately, a characteristic mode of doing philosophical discussion is what it is. So that's just another little hint of what's coming. They're going to start to break things down, and they're going to try to do it by halves. So when we're looking out at the world, like I'm looking at this phone now, but that's just a name that I'm giving it. But say if I was just brand new, if an alien just came into my body, I was looking around, how do I know that this phone isn't attached to this tripod? I might consider this all one object. Or that the camera, the little circle I can see in the camera, how would I distinguish that as separate from the rest of the phone, for example? Or even just looking at the bed I'm sitting on attached to the tripod and attached to the ground. Why would it not all be one object, like an altar or something? The altar of philosophy. But by using this halving method, they start to, through differentiation, distinguish recognizable traits and start to separate these objects from reality. So that's why it's going to be a little strange as we get into it. Visitor. Now, do you think the statesman, the king, the slave master, and the estate agent too all belong to a single category? Or do you think that there are as many areas of expertise here as there are names? Imagine a person who, despite holding no official position, is qualified to act as an advisor to one of the state physicians. Wouldn't we have to use the same professional title in referring to him as we would when referring to the person whose advisor he is? Young Socrates. Yes. Visitor. What about a person who, again, despite holding no official position himself, is qualified to advise the king of some country or other? Won't we say that he has the knowledge which, by all rights, the king himself ought to have? Yes. Now, the knowledge a true king has is kingship. Yes. And whether a person with this knowledge is in fact a ruler or an ordinary citizen, it will be perfectly correct, as long as we're thinking about just his expertise anyway, to say that he has what it takes to be a king. Yes, that would be fair. And this makes me think of Machiavelli, and there's a little intro in the start of The Prince, in which I think it actually talks about how it was a good thing that he decided to sort of take a step back, and rather than playing the game for himself to try to become a statesman or a prince, Machiavelli instead took the role of an advisor. But he came to mind when I read this because I was thinking, he would be that sort of person, wouldn't he? It would be like a consultant for a king or a prince. And that's what we're trying to track down now, is the consultant / the person with the expertise who would be a statesman. So it could be a consultant or an actual statesman or a king, or in this case they're talking about even an estate manager or a slave master. But as we move on, we'll strike those other options out later on. And there's a little extra here in the notes that I'll just read. Here is an initial emphatic commitment on Plato's part to the idea that the areas named are merely different areas of application of what is itself one single expertise. Aristotle's denial of this forms a fundamental point of disagreement in political theory. He denies exactly this assertion at Politics 1252a7 to 23, clearly with the present passage in mind. For Aristotle, there is a basic difference between exercise of authority over inferiors and political rule, which is distinguished by being exercised over those who are equal and similar to oneself. Hence, it is appropriate in a political community to rule and be ruled in turns. Here, Plato rejects such a difference in kind, though he regards ruler and ruled as far less different than they are in the Republic. Note also that here Plato introduces an equivalence between the statesman and the king. This also happens abruptly at Euthydemus 291b. In view of the normal Greek association of kingship with foreign and arbitrary rule, the king normally meaning the king of Persia. This is an indication that familiarity with the Republic is presupposed, king standing in for ideal rulers like the guardians. Plato connects the two uses shortly. Just another little bit of interesting work on the part of different philosophers over the generations. You had Plato coming out with all this stuff, and then you have Aristotle looking at it later on and going, I'm not sure I agree with that, and jiggying some things around. Now let's have a little look at this section, and then we're going to start to skim a bit more quickly. Visitor. And there's no difference between a state manager and a slave master. No, of course not. But when I do like a little nod or something, I'm switching character. Visitor. Well, as far as their government is concerned, is there any difference between a larger state with its pretensions and a small state with its pomp? None at all. So the answer to our present question is obvious. All these cases involve a single branch of knowledge which could be called kingship or statesmanship or estate management. We won't mind in the slightest which of these titles is used. Of course not. Another obvious point is that what any king can contribute towards the maintenance of his authority manually and by physical means in general is very little compared to what he can do with intelligence and strength of mind. Yes, that's clear. So shall we say that a king's affinities lie more with theoretical knowledge than with the kind which is manual and basically practical? I'm sure we should. What if we could go on to make distinctions within theoretical knowledge? Would that be the next thing for us to do? Yes. And then, we're going to skip a little bit more quickly now. They start differentiating between the different kinds of knowledge. You've got arithmetic, theoretical knowledge. Then you've got the arithmetician notices a difference between certain quantities, but we don't expect his function to go beyond that. Then we look at the master builder. The master builder possesses theoretical knowledge. He has to tell each of the workmen what to do and see that they carry out his instructions. One evaluates and the other issues instructions. So the arithmetician will evaluate, but the master builder issues instructions as well. He goes that extra step. He doesn't just evaluate. He'll go, okay, do this, do that, and get the building built. Theoretical knowledge, instructional knowledge, and evaluative knowledge. So we divide theoretical knowledge into instructional and evaluative. Would that be a reasonable distinction to make? Well, it's always nice for partners to agree. Of course. Oh, I'm sure it would. Well, it's always nice for partners to agree, of course. And as long as we're partners in our current venture, we won't bother with others' opinions. Why should we? I just thought that was a funny bit of dialogue that the visitor and young Socrates, they're going into this very deep, nitty-gritty philosophical dialogue, and then they just have a nice little bit of, I don't know if you call that repartee. Maybe I'd have to check the meaning of that, repartee, but they keep it light, and this happens throughout, and this is why this book is quite unique. And it says on the back, actually, what's going on here, but it's still a little unclear. Basically, I think it was a dialogue That's great, isn't it? I think there was a dialogue, and Plato and maybe some other people were recording bits of it, and then Plato's tried to put it all together, what happened in the conversation. All the valuable bits. Is a king a spectator of some kind? So we'd put him in the evaluative category. Or does he know how to issue instructions, since he does, after all, exercise authority? Obviously he does. He does that. He issues instructions. So we would qualify him as having expertise in issuing instructions. I think we can distinguish between kings and heralds in exactly the same way as we do between retailers and producer-sellers who sell their own produce. What do you mean? What retailers do is take over other people's produce and resell it when it's already been sold once. Heralds take over other people's ideas, which they've received in the form of instructions, and deliver exactly the instructions they were given all over again to a different set of people. Should we bracket what kings do with translators, bosuns, diviners, and heralds? Or people who issue their own instructions? In which case, we come up with a new class, producer instructional class, because they don't just do what the retailers and heralds and that do. They don't just take something from somewhere, repurpose it, and then send it on, whether it's a message as a herald or a product as a retailer. They're coming up with it themselves and then issuing instructions out of their own mind and their own creative process. Here, Plato makes a virtue of indifference to actual usage. This is a little note down the bottom. Even though we are working through low-key examples, we are not concerned to map common sense. This is what I was saying earlier, that you're sort of listening. I mean, I'm skipping out quite a lot of the additional stuff, where you'd see just how much, for want of a better word, guff is going on. It's not guff, it's just, this is the process. But from a zoomed out perspective, if somebody walks in, you'd be like, what are you talking about? Why are you being so weird, talking about things in this way? But to produce a rationally defensible account of what we are seeking, philosophers should not quibble over words. Somebody who comes in and says, what are you doing? Why don't you just cut to the wick of what we're talking about? There'll be an example of when young Socrates does that a little bit later on. And it sounds really sensible, actually, at first glance. But there's a problem with it, and there is a reason for doing this process. And Plato says we shouldn't quibble over the words. So the focus is more on the process than the words themselves. And when you're saying stuff, it sounds kind of ridiculous, that's fine. That's fine. You need to detach from the ridiculousness of what you're talking about so that you can get to the significant stuff via a more sort of clean route. Again, like if you're an alien and you're coming in looking at this situation and you know nothing about Earth, you don't know anything, then how would they start to differentiate the phenomena that they're seeing around them? And by doing that, you remove a lot of the filters that you naturally have that blind you from seeing the differentiations, which may seem trivial at the time, but later on it makes sense. But I'm getting a little bit ahead. There'll be a good example of that later on. So now that we've adequately separated these two groups into what comes from others and what originates from oneself, they do that. I'm skipping. I've just underlined little quotes here. We won't find that the reason that any ruler issues instructions is to produce results. Obviously they do. So there are two distinct classes over what we're trying to produce results in. We're trying to produce results in things which are inanimate or things which are alive. And the statesman is producing results in the things that are alive, in the sphere of living creatures, not in the inanimate sphere. A king can hardly be said to exercise his authority over inanimate objects as a master builder does, after all. People either taking care of single creatures or herds. I'm just going to read just the underlined bits because I'm trying to add in words to make sense, but I'll just say them and then try to link them up later. We're surely not going to find statesmen maintaining individual creatures as drovers or grooms do. Stock farmers of horses and cattle are a closer analogy. What shall we call the collective maintenance of a number of living creatures at once? Shall we call it herd maintenance or collective maintenance? And now I'm going to read this section and you're going to see what I was referring to earlier with regard to sort of cutting to the quick and in doing so skipping over some of the necessary steps. And when this happens, it sounds really logical, and this is why I read it a few times, why I didn't just go into the next episode just reading this normally. I wanted to run over a little bit more because I really didn't understand the problem at first. Whichever of these names crops up as we talk. Well said, Socrates. If you can retain this relaxed attitude towards terminology, your stock of wisdom will increase as you get older. For the time being, however, let's do as you suggest. But can you find a way to show that herd maintenance is divisible? That would enable us to concentrate our search on half the ground in an area which is double the size it might be. I'll do my best. I think there's a difference between the maintenance of human beings and the maintenance of beasts. I'll just jump to the note down below here, and then we'll go back. The idea that humans are not merely a flock is not rejected, but the visitor refuses to take this as an obvious step. It has to emerge from further definition and the interpretation of the myth. Otherwise, we could not be sure that we had found a real form rather than the result of an artificial distinction. So, let's hear what he said again. He said, young Socrates said, maintenance of human beings and the maintenance of beast, visitor. That was a very decisive and courageous effort at division, but we mustn't let this happen again if we can help it. We mustn't let what happen again? We must beware of singling out just one small part and contrasting it with a number of large parts, and of doing so without any reference to classes. Any part we distinguish must also constitute a class. If one's quarry can legitimately be distinguished from everything else at a single stroke, that's wonderful. That's what you were trying to do a moment ago. You saw that the discussion was heading in the direction of human beings. You thought you had the division within your grasp, and so you rushed the discussion. But delicate work is tricky, my friend. It's safer to proceed by making an incision down the middle. You're more likely to meet with true categories that way, and the importance of that for analysis cannot be overestimated. And then young Socrates is like, I don't quite see what you mean. And Visitor says, I like you, Socrates, so I'll try to explain. A thorough explanation is out of the question at the moment, but I'd better try to clarify things by taking the matter a little further forward. Why can't you just divide between, beasts and humans? We're looking at the sphere of living creatures, right? So we've got humans and animals. And, why wouldn't you just do that? Well, we're trying to do this halving process so that we don't jump too far ahead. That's basically what Visitor is trying to say to young Socrates. So he says, all right, here's an analogy. Suppose one wanted to divide the human race into two parts, the whole human race into two parts. What most Greeks do is make the division by separating Greeks from all the rest. They use the single term barbarian for all the other categories of people. By the way, barbarian in this context, in the time they're speaking, literally just means someone whose language one does not understand. Which which would be quite a dilution or a concentration. You basically go from the 100% of people, instead of doing 50%, cutting you down to just 50%, you're doing like 0.5% of the people, because it's not only just the Greeks you're now focusing on, but it's just the Greeks within the Greek civilizations who can understand one another. Many of them couldn't even understand one another. So you're down to a very small percentage, much less than half. So he says, someone wanted to... what most Greeks do is all the rest. They use the single term barbarian for all the other categories of people, despite the fact that there are countless races who never communicate and are incompatible with one another, and then expect there to be a single category too, just because they've used a single term. Or here's another example of someone thinking he's dividing quantity into two classes. Suppose he takes the number 10,000 on its own and treats it as a distinct class or quantity, and then makes up a single name for all the rest of the numbers, and the use of the name might make him regard that category too as a single class, different from the first one. A better division, of course, one which forms a true division into two distinct classes, would be to divide quantity into odd and even, or to divide the human race into male and female. And there's a little note here that says, the second example also produces two parts, neither of which has a naturally unifying principle. Note that Plato holds that gender division, unlike linguistic divisions, and presumably the ethnic divisions underlying these, does give naturally unifying principles. So there you go. But Lydians or Phrygians or any other group should only be separated and contrasted with everyone else when it's impossible to find that either of the two parts one has isolated is a class rather than just a part. So there's a difference between parts and classes. You're quite right, but the crucial question is how one can become familiar enough with class and part not to confuse them, but to see that they are different. That's a very good question indeed, Socrates, but a complex one to answer. We've already strayed quite a long way from the matter at hand, and here you are encouraging us to stray even further. I think we should probably return to the interrupted discussion for now. If there's time later, we'll follow the tracks of the problem you've raised. However, it's essential for you not to fall into the trap of thinking that my account constitutes a clear exposition of the issue. What account? When I said that classes and parts are different, what of it? Any class is bound also to be a part of whatever it's being said to be a class of, but a part is not similarly bound to be a class. That's what I was getting at, Socrates. So please don't ever think I meant that things could be the other way round. All right. Now, here's the next question. How to divide herd maintenance. Human beings, all other beasts, right? That's what we said before. You were isolating a part and then thinking that all the creatures you were left with formed a single class simply because there was available to you a single name, beasts, which you could apply to them all. And that alien, if the alien was here, he wouldn't have that single name beasts. He'd be looking at all the living creatures on Earth and he'd be like, I don't know which is a beast and which is a human. I'd have to look more closely to distinguish, right? Imagine another species which is endowed with intelligence as cranes. Yeah, and this is what I'm saying about the alien. So imagine a crane, which is supposed to be intelligent. They might exaggerate the importance of their own species by making cranes into a single class to contrast with all other species, and they might lump together all other creatures, including humans. And what else would they call them but beasts? So that's the problem with what young Socrates was doing. Less likely if we don't take the class of creatures as a whole and try to divide it. That's how the mistake occurred earlier. So instead we're going to divide into gregarious animals. All creatures we're going to divide into tame and wild. That's a bit more of a 50-50 sort of measure. Creatures capable of being domesticated have long been called tame, while those which aren't are called wild. Obviously, lots of humans are still wild, but he's talking about animals that are capable of being domesticated. Our haste has made us achieve less speed in making our divisions. That's the he references this proverb, which in the translation translates as that. Our haste has made us achieve less speed in making our divisions. Now, let's do a bit more divisioning, and I'm reading underlined bits, I'm skipping bits out. That there are tame fish in the Nile, and that the Persian king also has some in ponds. It's just possible that you've seen some in people's fountains. In Thessaly, you must have heard reliable reports of how people keep geese and cranes there. So we've got two kinds of creatures which are kept in herds. Some live in water, and some on dry land, which can be domesticated. That's what he's saying about the fish. There are some fish that can be domesticated. And there are some birds that can be domesticated as well. So we'll include those in the tame animals. And then dividing those, we got ones on land and then ones in water. So now we've narrowed down statesmanship to the control of water. We've got water-based maintenance and land-based maintenance. So kingship falls under land-based division of herd maintenance. That's what kingship is at the moment as we're defining it through our reasoning process. And it's going to get weirder. So we've got creatures with wings and those with feet. And we're going to look at the ones with feet. And then we've got one path which is a shortcut, involves separating a small segment from a large one. The other conforms more closely to the principle we enunciated earlier of cutting as close as possible to the middle, but would take longer. Just another note on the process. And now we're down to creatures which have horns and creatures which don't. Again, if I'm that alien and I'm looking and I'm narrowing it down to just these animals, I've got ones on land that can be tame, not wild. And actually there will be a question about what's tame and what's wild. I think that's a good question. But then they're looking at ones with feet, ones with wings. Then we're looking at ones with feet that are on land, that can be tame, that don't have horns. And then we've got hoofs that are split, or in technical terminology, uncloven. And then we've also got animals which interbreed or breed only with their own kind. For instance, horses and asses can bear each other's offspring, while no other tame, gregarious, hornless creatures can interbreed. So the statesman is concerned with creatures which cannot interbreed. Only two species remain, since dogs don't really deserve to count as gregarious animals. What criterion shall we use to distinguish the remaining two? And then he's talking about this dividing process again. He goes, we're going to use the diagonal, and then the diagonal of the diagonal. How are we equipped for walking? Isn't it just like the diagonal, which can be raised up to 2 feet? He's doing a little play on words here as well. He's sort of joking. Other species, the diagonal of our human diagonal, since it can be raised up to twice 2 feet. And that's not all, Socrates. This is going to make sense in a second, just bear with me. And that's not all, Socrates. Can you see that as a result of all our dividing, something else has happened, which might make people laugh and so go down well with them? What's that? The human race has been paired and kept pace with the most noble and easygoing of all creatures. Yes, I can see that. What a strange thing to happen. Well, isn't it fair for the slowest creatures to be the piggiest failures at running? Because now we're looking at humans and pigs. Somehow, in the process of elimination, we've ended up with just these two animals left. And here's an even more amusing consequence. Do you realize that in running along with this herd, the king has also kept up with people who have trained hard for the easy life? You see, Socrates, this is a particularly clear case of something that came up before in the Sophist, that the relative prestige or humbleness of something is entirely irrelevant to the kind of logical inquiry we're engaged in. and this is important, this part, this kind of inquiry doesn't sneer at trivial things and prefer important things. For its purposes, it is concerned only with the truth at every stage. Because you might have gone pigs and humans. Well, obviously we're not going to put pigs with humans, so we'll just rule out the pigs. But just by following the process, it can maybe reveal something about humans as well. I think what we should have done then is break creatures with feet down immediately into a two-footed category. So now he's like looking back retrospectively at what they should have done. Break creatures down with feet down immediately into a two-footed category and a four-footed category. We'd have seen that human beings are paired only with winged creatures, and we would then have divided gregarious two-footed creatures into a feathered category and a featherless category. This would have made the art of herding human beings clearly visible, and we could then have taken the statesman king and instituted him as the charioteer, so to speak, of this art. We could have handed over the reins of the state to him, seeing that this branch of knowledge is rightfully his. Now he's going to summarize. We started by taking theoretical knowledge and distinguishing an instructional part of it. And we then drew on an analogy to make up the term producer instructional for a further subdivision. Next, within this producer instructional branch, we isolated the not unimportant art of maintaining creatures. We found that a category of creature maintenance was herd maintenance, and that a category of herd maintenance, in its turn, was the herding of creatures with feet. Within the herding of creatures with feet, the crucial segment we distinguished was the art of maintaining those which lack horns, and if you want to encapsulate a single term the relevant subdivision of this art of maintaining creatures which lack horns, you have to combine at least three components and call it the branch of knowledge which is concerned with the herding of species which cannot interbreed. As for the subdividing of this class, since the art of herding human beings is the one section left which deals with two-footed gregarious creatures, then it is exactly what we are after, the art we've been calling both kingship and statesmanship. Do any of the others have rivals who, despite going under different professional titles, maintain that they are qualified to look after the same herd as well? So that was the summary of how we reached that, and that's a pretty neat paragraph. So if you wanted to get the whole video basically so far, you would just listen to that paragraph and hear the reasoning, the processing. They combine components like herd, gregarious creatures, two-footed, put them together, and then create a class of just that. And a few other components that they pile together to make classes, and then they're slowly dividing, subdividing, until we niche all the way down to just the people that the king deals with. And now we're looking at other aspects. For instance, think of any merchant, farmer, or miller, for instance. Think of trainers and doctors as well. I'm sure you're aware that they would all take issue with our people herding statesmen, and would come up with all kinds of arguments to insist that responsibility for maintaining human beings is their concern, and that they aren't limited to just the common run of people, but are actually responsible for the rulers as well. Like a doctor. A doctor would look after the king, and the king, maybe, sometimes you see that in movies, TV shows, stories or whatever, they'll have some mighty king, and then the doctor's like, you're going to have to leave matters of state till later in the day. You need a bit more time in bed, or you're going to have to take this medicine before you go to the meeting with the neighbouring king or whatever to negotiate for war. No, sorry, you got to take your Calpol first. And the king's going to be like, oh, okay, and have to listen to the doctor. Maybe. This kind of dispute never arises in the case of cattle herders. So a cattle farmer maintains his herd by himself, doctors them by himself, acts as a kind of go-between in their love affairs by himself, and when they're in labour with offspring to be brought into the world, he and he alone supplies expertise in midwifery. So, in other professions, you might have other people sort of chiming in to look after the herd or the people who are being looked after. But in the cattle farmer's case, it's basically all on him, and he just does pretty much everything himself. And that's not all. These animals do not have a limited capacity for taking their ease and responding to music, and there's no one better than he at calming them down and charming them into docility. So, as I'm reading this, just be thinking about what the king is doing. No one else can supply his herd with music as well as he can. Thinking of Donald Trump there. Whether he plays instruments or sings with no accompaniment. For example, that would be something a lot of people would say, regardless of which side of the aisle you're on. You would say that the cattle, to put it that way, that Trump would be herding, they like his music the best. They don't want to listen to other cattle herders, right? I don't see, then, how we can consider our definition of a king accurate and incorrigible. We've made him our expert in herding and maintaining the human herd, when there are countless others disputing his claim, and all we've done is concentrate on him rather than them. We were right to be worried a short while ago, then. We suspected that, although we'd certainly described a king in outline, we wouldn't have a portrait of the statesman that was complete in all its details until we'd stripped away the surrounding horde with their rival claims to maintain the same herd, like the doctors, the whoever else there was, the farmers, the millers, the trainers. We need to strip away all of those as well, the surrounding horde, with their rival claims to maintain the same herd, and made the king stand out on his own, separate from his rivals and untainted by their qualities. Then that's what we better do, Socrates, if we want to avoid an account which would be, in the final analysis, flawed. So there you go. And I think that's going to be enough for today. Thank you for staying with me. If you managed to get all the way through that process, let me know what you think of the process itself. I appreciate it's a little bit eggy and muggy at times, and I can't say that I understand